Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. I'm joined here with John and Dee. I was about to say join here in the studio with John and Dee. I wish we had a studio. We are looking at chapter 2 of Generous Justice. Thanks, John, for reminding me. A book by Timothy Keller. We've been going through this book, trying to get deeper and closer to the Word of God through insights that Timothy Keller has given us, and hopefully be able to try and understand a little bit more about the theme of justice. Last week, we looked at the theme of what is doing justice and what that is about. And this week, we read the chapter on justice and the Old Testament. I don't know about you guys, about what your initial reactions were to even the theme justice and the Old Testament, but I know for me personally, it kind of points me back to my childhood as I start to paint almost pictures of this God who is about to ready to strike down certain things upon humanity because he's angry, because he's vicious, because he's wild, because he's all these different things, especially when I think about the God of the Old Testament. But this chapter really brought out some other concepts about God, specifically about justice. And so we're going to take a little bit of time just to share between us some of our initial thoughts as to what really was brought out to us in this chapter. So let's start here, and let me start by saying this. This chapter really brought out the idea that God had an ideal that he wished for the people of Israel to achieve, and that ideal was to allow his people to have a community of justice. And that was written into every policy, into every idea, into every notion in terms of their identity as the people of Israel. Dee, I know that resonated with you, particularly as you were reading throughout this chapter. Were there any particular thoughts around the idea of God creating a community of justice that really just struck you as you read this chapter?
I think it's on page 22, toward the bottom, the last paragraph, where it says the Mosaic laws of social justice are grounded in God's character, and that never changes. And and I have that highlighted because I believe this is truth. I believe that. I know that there's been a lot of controversy around, to what extent do we follow the, New Testament, and what do we believe in and all that. But I believe just as overall that Old Testament. The Old Testament is definitely is still applicable today, especially around when you're looking at God's character. And you just mentioned that, your vision of God's character in the Old Testament is that of, scary violence. Yeah, right. But I think even within that, if we do understand the motivation behind such action, I think that then we're able to, reconcile the two different gods of the Old and the New Testament. But aside from that, I think, definitely God's character never changes. And I think I think this was actually meant as a command. It wasn't even just it's just some lofty idea.
Right.
I think it was actually his command for the Israelites to follow. And as long as we obeyed, right, that this ideal, the will of God of how our social justice should be played out would have been perfectly good. It would have been, but obviously, we do definitely have a problem with obedience. So
to give one example, there are many different examples, but look at one example that Keller kind of just brought out in this chapter was the idea that the command was given to all landowners when the reaping of the harvest took place on a regular basis, that they would not go to the the entire limits of their land produce, but
Mm-hmm.
they would rather leave almost like a perimeter available so that the poor can come and reap for themselves in order to participate in some
Right.
kind of, I guess, journey out of poverty, so to speak. And that was that. It's almost. It's almost, I'm not, ironic is not the word, but it's almost, it's just very interesting that God does command that, only because he has to.
And you see that prime example. I mean, you see that very story happening in the story of Ruth and Naomi, right? That's what
Right,
they did.
right. And it was because of those laws that it created a system for the poor no longer to be poor, or at least find a route out of poverty.
Right.
John, you wanted to add to that?
And I like how Keller calls these, I don't know whether to call them laws or not. He calls them civil laws.
Right.
And the Mosaic civil laws are the ability to try to create equality among Israelites.
Right.
And Sam, I think you mentioned something about, this community of believers that, through
Community
Moses,
of justice.
community of justice. God is trying to create through Moses this community. But I think these civil laws are important because I think this community stands in stark contrast to the pagan community that they're surrounded by. And I think that would have appeal from the pagans, looking in and saying, hey, maybe there is another way of doing things.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I had the opinion of trying to assume what would I look like. What imagine I was looking in on the Israelite camp, and so I know that you want to mention something later on about the whole idea of Jubilee and stuff. I would tend to look in on that and think, are you crazy? No, I'm not giving away my land to someone else. No, I'm not forgiving my debtors, my of the money that they owe me after 7 years. Are you crazy? That doesn't sound attractive to me.
Well, that sounds like human nature to me. And I think human nature stands in stark contrast to God and his ways, as at least in the way it was originally meant to be.
Right.
So it's interesting. But I mean, you're looking at pagan communities where the most powerful or the wealthiest control things, and often it was the priestly part of that community, or the kingly part working with the priestly part, that had absolute power, and there was these huge disparities. And if you weren't in the upper part of that community, you lived a life of servitude, if not just outright slavery to that community. And here you have, the Israelites that serve a God that's not even seen, but still leads through this man, Moses, who's not a king and not a priest, but, is setting up a community of justice where there aren't people that have these extreme wealths that overcome everyone else and cause slavery. I mean, in fact, all these people come from a community of slavery, and so in a lot of ways know better. And God is constantly taking them back. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, to this better place.
Definitely. And I think the one thing that many of these policies that God creates and commands them to obey is to try and dispel greed from the people.
Right.
And I'm going to read one quote on page 30 when he talks about why the landowners were not allowed to harvest outside of the margins of their field. God did not want them to squeeze every cent of profit out of their land and then think that by giving to charity, they were doing all they could for the general community welfare. Rightly so. It goes against every sinew in my body that says, no, I'm going to make as much money as I possibly can. I'm going to milk the system and I'm going to make sure I become rich, which is very much where we're at today. But these systems God creates in order to try and reverse the carnal mentalities that we all have as individuals, which is quite profound. Did you have anything else to add, John, about the year of Jubilee and stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've read through about the year of Jubilee before, and I'm always just blown away. I mean, it's a Sabbath, so to speak. So, and I love the Sabbath. I like everything about it. And I think it was very much set up by God for us on a weekly basis.
Sure.
But then you have this every 7 years, but then the seventh, you know, is that the 49th or the 50th year? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier as to whether, which one that is, but that's a year where there's actually a complete and total reset where people go back to their original properties. Because often people, would become destitute for, a number of reasons. And he mentions 3 reasons, but, your most valuable property is literally the property you own and your family grew up on and that you're responsible for, and where often most of these people are making their entire living from. But you could sell that, and then often you not only get the money for that to help you out, but then you continue to work your own property. But God, saw a need to not have that go on forever, and eventually, turn around and come back and give you a chance to start again. And Keller mentions that, within every generation, which was roughly 50 years, there was a chance to kind of regroup and restart. And
can I read a quote that just points
healthy
to that directly on page 28? It says, on average, each person or family had at least a once-in-a-lifetime chance to start afresh, no matter how irresponsibly they had handled their finances or how far into debt they had fallen.
Yeah. And then I was touching on the 3 different causes of poverty that Keller mentions, at least back in that time, was oppression, calamity, and then personal moral failure. And I mean, see a lot of that these days even. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons you could get in trouble. And yeah, like you said, every generation had a chance to benefit from a year of Jubilee. But then my question earlier was, did a year of Jubilee ever happen?
And you have an interesting theory that I'd love you to be able to share with us, with everyone about, because I think it's quite relevant to the chapter. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, and I haven't researched it out well, but I don't see a lot of biblical evidence that a year of Jubilee ever happened. Now, it was a good thing, and I'm guessing when things were going well, it was one of those things that might have happened that you just never had recorded, because unfortunately, a lot of what happens in the Bible is when the Israelites strayed away from the God that brought them out of Egypt. I did look up online, literally, did the year of Jubilee ever happen? And Wikipedia came up, and it was interesting because in a lot of ways it got politicized. I mean, they kind of talk about it being the end of 7 sevens, and briefly what it was, where, the slaves and prisoners were free, debts were forgiven, and the mercies of God would be particularly manifest, which I like, because God's always got his mercy for us. But it was it sounds like a year of celebration where everything gets reset. But then, a paragraph or 2 later, the second paragraph talks about a dispute as to whether it's the 49th or the 50th year, which sounds a little pharisaical to me. And then even more pharisaical is, whether it actually even happened. And there's this quote where it says the Torah talks about the observance of Jubilee only applying when the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel according to their original tribes, and that when there was the exile of the tribes, specifically Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, that it never really happened. And so, I mean, it sounds like maybe if it did happen, it was early on, and it hasn't really happened since, which would be easy if you're a Pharisee or a Sadducee, or even the scribes or priests, which were made up of Pharisees and Sadducees often. I mean, these were powerful people in the community, and it would be easy for them to turn that year of Jubilee switch off and say, no, we aren't doing that, because, it involves them giving up property, giving up people, and potentially giving up wealth. which all of a sudden they're in a position of power. And that's often where disparities start, even today.
And so the essence of trying to possibly do away with God's commands is because it just doesn't benefit the rich and the privileged.
Right.
And it doesn't allow the rich and privileged to get richer, and it doesn't allow the privileged to get even more privileged as a result, which is very interesting, because this, what God is trying to command to the people is to charter a new way of living that enables equity to run across the entire community, something upon which ridiculously rich people don't get to benefit as much as they want to. Very interesting. It's the first, I've never really questioned the idea of whether the actual year of Jubilee happened, but it's definitely something to look into. Dee, was there anything else that really struck you as you were reading through the chapter?
I mean, I just, I think that, you know, God, obviously, again, based on his character, you know, relating to the gleaning part of how some of the policies that he had placed, you know, it's, you know, he's really in the business of, you know, giving back people's dignity and independence and self-sufficiency. You know, instead of just giving handouts, you know, he had given them a command for the way for people to be able to get out of debts and
Right.
poverty and be able to take care of themselves. But again, I mean, like we're just talking about now, I think these things only work when you are in that relationship with God and you are
Right.
in obedience.
Right, definitely. There's a lot going on in this chapter that really points to God trying to teach humanity about the value of equity. One of the things that is brought out in terms of his character is right at the end on page 40, and I'm not purposely jumping to this so that we have to end per se, but I just wanted to bring it out to see what you guys think. It's a quote on page 40 at the end of the chapter. It says this: "But the biblical God is not like that at all." When it says not like that, it is referring to the idea that God has a hierarchy of favor the rich over the poor. He says, he does not call everyone to bring sacrifices of the same kind and value, for that would have automatically made it easier for the rich to please God. And this is a reference to the idea that when the sacrificial system was set up and God required a sacrifice of a lamb or whatever it is from most people, most poor people couldn't afford that kind of sacrifice to come and be able to participate in the service for forgiveness. And so literally God said to the poor people, just bring a little bit of flour and you're sorted. And he goes on to say, instead, God directs that each person should bring what they can, and if their heart is right, that will give them access to his grace. For indeed, grace is the key to all. The center of this system that he creates for humanity is literally pivoted on grace all throughout everything. The central pivot upon society is anything but grace, in my opinion. It is the antithesis to how God runs government, the running of people, equity, the growth of all kinds of people groups, and those who earn more, those who earn less, those who earn an immediate amount. It's not grace that charters the path. And this is why I think it is so controversial. This is why I think it's very plausible for you to suggest, John, that more than likely the rich boycotted God's system because it did not benefit them. And it did not allow them to be able to participate in some of the pleasures and desires that they wanted to. And it robbed them of power. Definitely robbed them of power. Imagine setting up a company that would profit you for 7 years, because that's really all as much as you can plan for, really, only to realize that you have to also plan for the reality that a percentage of your property is going to go back to its original owners after 7 years. That's quite tough to try and work through. Any personal takeaways for you guys as you read through this chapter that really pushed you forward?
So the text that Keller mentioned that kind of jumped out at me was this Corinthians 8, 13 to 15.
Yes.
And I don't want to open up a whole nother can of worms on this.
But you're going to. Go on.
I might. So it reads, our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but there might be equality. And so this is Paul talking. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. And then there will be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. And I think the first question that jumped out at me was literally in the first paragraph. And it says, are the laws of God, of the Old Testament, binding on Christians today? And I think so often we overlook the Old Testament and we say, well, you know, Jesus came and all of that went away. We hang on to the 10 Commandments and then we follow Jesus and the Gospels. But the Old Testament is rich in civil laws. Now, I think it has to be taken into context with the times, you know, back then compared to now. But even now, I mean, I like the idea of the year of Jubilee, and I can't help but thinking, if something like that existed now, wouldn't the world be such a better place? And then part of me goes back and says, well, you know, maybe if there hadn't been sin in this world of sin, would there have been a year of Jubilee, or would things have just naturally followed along in equality? And the best example of that I have is probably the very earliest Christian churches. There were groups of people meeting in homes, and people were selling property that they didn't need and giving it to the church, and this church was turning around and feeding and caring for people. And things went great for a while. But then, you know, some people started worrying, well, you know, some of these women aren't getting treated as equally as other women. And then actions had to be taken. And so it was only brief, unfortunately.
Definitely. Dee, any other thoughts that have really caused you to move forward in your thinking?
Yeah, for me, you know, the author listed 3 causes of the poverty. And, you know, he mentions the oppression, calamity, and the personal moral failure. I think in our society, we put much more emphasis on a personal moral failure as somebody being in poverty. And I think that really keeps a lot of people from actually even wanting to help, wanting to put any kind of resources or input to try to alleviate that. And honestly, I think it's actually the oppression that is really the number one cause. And oppression can come in many different forms, right? And the book obviously talks about just the segregation in itself, right? And had a huge impact here, I believe, in the States, in the United States. I don't know much about other countries, but definitely for, you know, sure. I mean, I studied it, I looked at it. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's no question in my mind. So I think that definitely, I mean, in the case study in the very back of the chapter, I've been going through that case study and really laying out what exactly was happening in this one particular town that shows this is very, I think, helpful in using that type of thing to educate people about, okay, this really is not necessarily personal moral failure, but different factors. Because I believe that as humans, we want to be engaged in a active, purposeful life work, but definitely, right, we don't have equality, we don't have equity, and there are a lot of oppressions in this world that keeps us from where we're at.
So based on,
I like,
go on, John.
well, I was just going to say, I like the fact that Dee brought this up, and it's interesting that you look at those three things. You look at oppression, you look at calamity, and you look at personal moral failure. And I couldn't help but thinking, what is the one thing you can impact? And I mean, personal moral failure, you can certainly help people, but ultimately a lot of it is on them and them having to make the changes they need to make. And calamity, I mean, it still happens today and you have almost no control over it. But oppression, I mean, that's the one thing that the disparities we have, at least in our society here in America, seem to make oppression worse and makes it a lot harder to kind of turn things around. And this whole Black Lives Matters movement is a good example of how things, people are just happy with the status quo and the way things have been. And it's just so hard to turn it around. Whereas if it had been changed, very abruptly and very significantly, decades, if not centuries ago, we might not have to deal with it like we are now.
Right. And I think both of you brought out a point that really struck me well, and kind of relates to what you're talking about. I'm going to quote page 38, where Timothy Keller reflects on the African Americans who immigrated from the South, and he says this. And the poverty of African Americans immigrating into Baltimore from the South was due to a great part of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws. Now, we know that in our last Pages to Progress book, we went through a whole breakdown of that. But here's what was powerful to me in my takeaway. By defining the problems, Timothy Keller defined the mission of the church, for me at least. And this is what he says: but the results of these factors, the Jim Crow laws, the slavery, the oppression, all of that, the results of these factors were addiction, family breakdown, criminal activity, depression, and the disintegration of community and the erosion of personal character. Those 6 things really jumped out at me, and made me even question, in terms of, if there is anything that we can do as a body of Christ believers who are engaged in trying to bring about a new Israel into society, it is at the very least picking one of these things and trying to reverse it. And that for me was really quite profound as I read those 6 things. Addiction, family breakdown, criminal activity, depression, disintegration of community, and the erosion of personal character. To me, growing up as a Christian, now being a pastor of a church and engaging in a community, I feel like God is really arresting our attention right now as a nation here in America to be proactive in reversing the results of oppression, and systematic racism and all manner of different things that have crumbled equality and equity in our society. And I think for me, the takeaway is, because I don't think that we are Jesus and we can necessarily have the power to instantaneously do every single one of these things, but I do think that we need to hold it very true to ourselves to pick one at the very least, individually and corporately as a community, to just pick one and say, I'm going to do what I can to try and change the status quo of society. That's my takeaway. I don't know if you guys want to respond before we close.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can ever do too much. And there's always a little bit of a battle. I'm talking about within my own family, between getting excited and wanting to give and participate in something, but at the same time being responsible, because I am providing for my wife and my children. And there's a certain responsibility that goes along with that. I think the Bible quote that jumped out at me was interesting, because it was this Deuteronomy 15:7-8, but specifically the very last part. And that is where it says, do not be tight-fisted towards your brother, your poor brother, but rather be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. For some reason, that jumped out at me. And honestly, it jumped out at me in the context of driving to and from work and these people that stand on the corners and they're just wanting some money.
Right.
And I've struggled with that. And because there's not a good example of what Jesus would do. Because Jesus didn't really handle money. He talks about the widow's mite. He bails Peter out with the temple tax. And he gets himself out of a tough situation by giving unto Caesar what is Caesar. But those are the only three examples I can see with Jesus handling money. And I've already mentioned the year of the Jubilee, but we live, at least I live right now, in a very urban area where there aren't any gleanings to be taken. But at the same time, I feel like, you are somewhat responsible for these people that need help. And so I don't know. I don't want to open up a whole can of worms on this because you can argue it both ways. And there's certainly the psychiatric part of this, and then whether it gets used for drugs and alcohol and smoking kind of stuff, the unhealthy part of it. But part of me says, I don't need to worry about that. If I have the means to be able to give and help people out, then even if I'm at a stoplight and I have a chance to give, then maybe I should more than I have, because I've always kind of justified, no, that's not the right thing to do. But after reading this chapter and that text in particular, especially that visual, be open-handed instead of tight-fisted. I think if you're going to err on the side of equality, I think you can go a long ways with generosity and not go wrong. Those are just my own personal feelings.
Did you want to respond, Dee? Because I have a few thoughts I can respond, but.
Well, I guess for myself personally, and I think with Kosuke as a family, just cash, money, okay, is something that we all need. We can't live in this society without it. And for us, money is one way that we can always give to relieve some suffering, if you will, relieve some concerns or whatever. And yes, we don't give out money to every person standing in the corner, but I do pray about it. When I see the person, I do tend to give more to the female. I'll come straight out and say that, okay? And but as I see that person in the corner, I do pray about it. I just simply just do a quick prayer. God, is this something that you want me to approach and give? And if I get a sense that this is what he's wanting at that time, I give it. If I don't, I just pass. Okay, so that's been kind of my thing, because I agree with John. I mean, you can't give to. I suppose you could. But I don't. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, for us, I guess when it comes to giving, it's money. Money is what people need, and that's what we rely on. And
if I could maybe just to try and tie this together, bring this to a close. This chapter has challenged us a lot. I think your reservations are valid. We all have reservations when it comes to. We all know those people who need money on the side of the road, and there are times that I have given, and there are times that I haven't. There are times that I have thought, you know what, here you go. I hope you use this well. And there are other times where I'm just thought, you know what, I don't trust you. I don't trust you because I don't know what you're going to do with the money. And I think if I was to just broaden the horizon a little bit, the truth is, we've been talking about these individuals who are on the side of the road, but actually there are systems of charity upon which if we were to unearth on a very deeper level, we would find out that many of these systems are compromised in and of themselves, in terms of their structures, in terms of how they function, in terms of what percentage that they actually keep and how they pay their employees. We can go, how far do you want to go in the rabbit hole? I'm sure we can unearth everything about every single company on the planet that we feel that we are given from some kind of altruistic part of ourselves. And I think the summation of what I offer is nobody can trust nobody. But the one thing that is consistent is the fact that God is inviting us to respond to the Holy Spirit who places a call upon our hearts. In all these instances, I think, Dee, you really brought this out. And John, you also wrestle with this as well, as much as you've been sharing this, I realized to myself, we all face this. The Holy Spirit talks to us in each and every moment and convicts us in that moment to give and or not to give. And I don't want to translate not giving as being tight-fisted, John. I think the idea of being tight-fisted, I think what the Bible is trying to bring out in this instance is I don't want to give because that means that I will be less richer. And that's the way that I translate that. And there are many times, because giving requires you to give up your privilege in that instance and recognize that just in that instance, and just recognize, you know what, I was going to use this money for something else, but I'm now going to use this for this instead. And so I think the one thing that we can walk away from, which is consistent and challenging for us on all different levels, is when and if the Holy Spirit inspires us to be able to give, sacrifice a privilege, or pour into a new system, if there's no extra field for you to offer, the poor, create a field per se of if the Holy Spirit is pointing us to do any of these things, then we need to be ready to act, because acting will accentuate God's community of justice that is still present today on the principles, not necessarily the policies, that carry over into our community, in the hope that God's glory will be glorified and people will look and see, hey, this community, hey, this person does things differently. I wonder why. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we are working towards as we're reading through this book, as we're picking these themes of the books that we're reading, that is leading us more and more closer to the idea of what does a true community of Christ look like? What does a kingdom community of Christ look like? I want to thank you guys for being with us in this conversation. I'm sure we can talk for hours and hours on end on various different things, but that's the beauty of reading, of growing in this. We want to invite you who are joining us on this journey from pages to progress. You can join the conversation vocally by joining us literally on this conversation. You just need to contact us and we'll be happily let you in on the conversation, or non-vocally by just reading along with us. I can't show it. Oh, there it is. By happily along reading with us, Timothy Keller, Generous Justice. You can order it off Amazon and it can get to you within a day or two. And next week we will be going on to chapter 3, which is now, what did Jesus say about justice? You were alluding to this subject, John, as you were talking about a few things today. Hopefully we'll go deeper into what you were alluding to. What did Jesus say about justice? I'm excited to find out more. If you'd like more information about the previous episodes, you can jump online to pages, online to our website, eastsidesda.org/pages to progress. And there you'll get all the episodes that you can watch at your leisure. Thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you a happy week wherever you are, what you're doing. Stay safe and God bless you. Bye.